Hello, this is Lori Brown, Managing Broker with Central Metro Realty in Austin, Texas. Today I'm going to be discussing the handling of leases in the 1 to 4 family residential resale contract. So last year, the 1 to 4 family was revised and became effective in April of 2021. And at the same time, TREC promulgated a new form, which you see here, the Addendum regarding residential leases, Form TXR-1953. It was promulgated last November and became effective in April of 2021 as well. And this form really enhanced and clarified the handling of existing leases on a residential property. And so before we get into this, I want to go back to the prior 1 to 4 family contract and show you how leases were handled in this contract. So you'll see here paragraph 10, possession. Here it is, B, leases. 1. After the effective date, seller may not execute any lease, including but not limited to mineral leases, or convey any interest in the property without buyer's written consent. So once the seller and buyer negotiated and came to terms and made their contract effective, the seller could not go and convey out any interest or change his interest in the property without the buyer's knowledge and consent. And so that, of course, makes sense. We wouldn't want to get to closing and have some interest be missing that the buyer planned on obtaining at closing. And B2, if the buyer is subject to any lease to which seller is a party, seller shall deliver to buyer copies of the lease and any move-in condition form signed by the tenant within 7 days after the effective date of the contract. This presented quite a problem because of that 7-day time period. If the buyer never saw the lease or leases until, say, day 7, and he had an option of 5 days, for example, then he would not have an option to terminate based on the lease terms that maybe he did not agree with. So that was a problem. And now we have this handled in the new contract and the coinciding addendum that we're going to talk about. So here in the new contract, paragraph 4, leases, leases have their own paragraph now, and this really is all about disclosure in this paragraph. It just like the old contract says, the seller is not aware of any leases except the ones that he's disclosed to the buyer, and that he may not make any changes to the leases, write a new lease, or convey out any interest without the buyer's written consent. And then the seller would check A, B, C, or any combination, or even all of those if there were residential leases in those categories on the property that he's selling. So 4A is residential lease. So if there was a residential lease, he would check 4A. And then B for fixture leases. And this would be an example like the seller has leased a propane tank and is the actual lessee here, and would then owe the propane tank company, and so that is a disclosure to the buyer that that equipment is leased. And then 4C would be natural resource leases. So here would be like in Texas, oil and gas, very common. Water, wind, or any other natural resources can be leased, and so the seller is disclosing here that there is a natural resource lease. And then C1 would be checked if the seller had already delivered copies of those leases to the buyer, or 2, they had not been delivered to the buyer and the seller needs a little extra time, and so he has 3 days to get those leases to the buyer. And then the buyer has a negotiated number of days to review. You see here in the blank. So buyer may terminate the contract within blank days. And then if he did not like the terms of the lease, could terminate and receive his earnest money back. So paragraph 4 is all about disclosure. In the prior contract, there really was no place where the seller could technically disclose that there were leases on the property. So now let's move over to the addendum regarding residential leases. And this is pertaining only to the residential leases. The mineral lease, the minerals and the fixtures, they have their own addenda. And so this is just residential leases. And here we have two options, A and B. We can check A if the seller and buyer have agreed that the seller will terminate the leases and have the tenants vacate prior to closing. Now, I like to point out here, this is not easy to accomplish sometimes, and it's really important for all of the parties to have a discussion about the time frame that would be needed to accomplish this. Sometimes it may mean extending that closing date out to do it. If we have an uncooperative tenant, it could even make it where we've got to do an extension. We get down to the end, we haven't gotten the tenant out. So it can cause some problems. So you want to be very communicative and clear on what's going to happen to terminate these leases. And then B, assignment and assumption of residential leases. The buyer is agreeing to assume the leases and will become the new landlord, and you would check either B1A, the buyer's already received the residential leases, or B1B, the seller has 3 days to get those leases to the buyer. The buyer can review and then terminate and receive earnest money if he's not in agreement with the lease terms. And then B2, at closing, seller shall transfer security deposits to the buyer if there are any. And at closing then, the buyer shall deliver to the tenant a signed statement acknowledging that the buyer has acquired the property and is responsible for the return of the security deposit and specifying the exact dollar amount. So in the old contract, there was no place to stipulate the transfer of the security deposits, and agents would find themselves putting that in special provisions, which we know is not the best way to handle that type of situation. We don't want to practice law, and we don't want to change the substance of the contract. So Trek, of course, has known this for a while and now has taken steps to help out agents in that way and clarify things. So here, the buyer is going to receive the security deposits, and then also there was some uncertainty in the past as to who was going to notify the tenant of the change in ownership, and so now it makes it incumbent upon the buyer to do that and to return the security deposit. And then B3, except as described below and to seller's knowledge for each residential lease, it's stating that A through G, these statements are true. These are all conditions of the property that are in force, or conditions of the property that are currently existing. And so unless the buyer explains it down there where it says explain. So we'll just read these quickly. The residential lease is in full force and effect. No tenant is in default or violation. No tenant has any prepaid rent. No tenant is entitled to any offset against rent, so there's no credits. There are no outstanding tenant claims against seller involving the property. There are no pending disputes with the tenant. And there are no other agreements, options, or rights outside of the lease that the buyer would not be aware of. So, and if any of that changes in B4, it says the seller has to cure it if anything happens or any condition exists that makes those statements untrue. And then if he cannot do that within 7 days, he has to let the buyer know, and then the buyer would have an additional 5 days to decide if he wanted to continue with this contract. And if he did not, he could terminate and receive back his full refund of earnest money. So this is how the leases are now handled, existing leases, and it really is going to help not only buyers and sellers but agents negotiate these contracts and get to closing without conflict. And so I'm really happy about these changes, and I think you'll find that it's very helpful to you and your business. So again, this is Lori Brown. If you are interested in learning more about joining Central Metro Realty, please call me or email me. I'd be happy to talk to you, and I'll talk to you again soon.